I rented the cabin for 3 quiet days before winter got heavier. The listing made it look simple. A small structure near a lake, nothing special. The host sent the access code and said the heat would be low when I arrived. But when I stepped inside, the place was already warm. Not just maintained temperature, but lived-in air. I didn't think much of it because the drive had been long. I dropped my bag, walked through the rooms, and checked what I had to work with. Everything seemed normal until I reached the bathroom. A used razor sat on the shelf. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't new. I moved it aside, assuming the cleaner ignored it. The evening felt uneventful. I heated dinner and tried to relax. A little after 7, I heard steps on the porch. They were calm and steady, not hesitant. Then came a knock, slow, like someone familiar with the door. When I opened it, a man stood close to the frame. He looked older than me, maybe late 40s, wearing a thin jacket that didn't fit the weather. His expression wasn't aggressive, just expectant, like he knew the inside of the cabin. He asked, "You staying long?" I told him I'd rented it for the weekend. He nodded but didn't leave. His eyes drifted past me into the living room, scanning like he was checking for changes. He asked if I'd moved anything. I didn't understand what he meant. Then he mentioned the razor. I told him the cleaner probably forgot it. He watched me for a moment, then stepped back and walked off the porch without another word. The interaction bothered me more than it scared me. There was something in his tone that made him sound like the cabin still belonged to him. I messaged the host, asking if she had neighbors who might stop by. She replied that no one should be on the property, and that she'd alert the sheriff if he returned. Around 10, I heard the door handle shift. Not violently, just a slow press, as if someone was testing it. When I said, "Someone is in here," the movement stopped. I didn't open the door. The person walked away with the same steady steps as before. I heard him move around the side of the cabin. Then silence. I barely slept. I kept the lights off and checked the porch through the blinds every few minutes. At one point, I heard faint movement by the kitchen window, like someone brushing against the wall. It eventually faded, but the sense of someone being close never left. In the morning, I noticed footprints near the side of the cabin. They weren't fresh enough for details, but they weren't there when I arrived. I updated the host, and she said someone from the sheriff's office might stop by. I tried focusing on normal tasks: breakfast, emails, a short walk, but kept thinking about the man's expression. It wasn't anger. It was ownership. In the afternoon, a car approached. I hoped it was the sheriff, but it was the same man. He got out of an old SUV and kept his head low, like he didn't want to be noticed. This time, he didn't come to the door. He opened the back of the SUV, pulled out a box, and walked straight to the shed behind the cabin. The host had told me it was for storage and should remain locked. He opened it easily. He stayed inside the shed for a long time. When he came out, he looked toward the cabin, checking if I was watching. I stepped out of sight. A moment later, he knocked again. Same slow rhythm. I didn't answer. The knocking got harder. When I stayed silent, he said through the door calmly, "This place isn't yours. I left my things here. I'm coming in." His tone wasn't threatening. It was factual, like someone stating a rule. I told him I had rented it legally, and he needed to leave. He didn't reply. I heard him circling the cabin again. Gravel shifted. Wood creaked under the porch, and the back window rattled like he tested it. He knew exactly where the weaker points were. Instead of forcing entry, he lingered outside, repeating the same slow pattern. Approach, pause, walk away, return. By early evening, I was exhausted. I kept the lights off and avoided the windows. When the sun set, I heard his SUV start. I watched through the blinds as it moved down the driveway until the headlights disappeared. I didn't trust that he was gone, so I stayed awake. Around midnight, he came back on foot. This time he didn't knock. He went straight to the back of the cabin. I heard metal scraping, then the shed door opening. A minute later, the back door handle shifted, more insistent than before, but still controlled. When that failed, he tapped the glass once, then whispered something I couldn't understand. I grabbed my phone and typed that he had returned, hoping the host or sheriff would see it quickly. Eventually, he walked toward the front porch. The boards creaked under his weight. Instead of trying the window, he sat on the step. I could hear him breathing through the thin wall. He stayed there for almost an hour. Every few minutes he exhaled, as if trying to steady himself. I didn't move. I didn't even shift my weight. I just listened. When I finally heard distant engine noise, most likely the sheriff, he stood up and walked into the woods. Not rushed, not panicked, just steady steps fading between the trees. The sheriff arrived minutes later. I explained everything, and he seemed unsurprised. He said the man had lived there after a divorce, stayed longer than he was supposed to, and never adjusted to the idea that the cabin was no longer his. They had dealt with him before. He said I wasn't in immediate danger, but recommended I leave in the morning. I agreed. The cabin no longer felt like a rental. It felt like I had stepped into someone else's unresolved life. At sunrise, I packed quickly. Before driving away, I looked at the shed. The lock hung open, and whatever the man brought in the box was gone. I never found out what was inside. I didn't ask the host, and she didn't volunteer the information. The only thing I cared about was getting distance between me and the cabin. Distance the former tenant clearly never intended to give anyone who stayed there. I rented the cabin because it was supposed to be right between two hiking trails I had been meaning to try before the weather got worse. The host described the area as quiet, but well used by outdoorsmen. When I arrived, the place looked exactly like the pictures. There was nothing ominous about it. The view from the porch was just a stretch of woods with patches of early snow. I carried my bags inside, checked the stove, and walked around the property to get familiar with it before the light faded. Behind the cabin, a few yards into the trees, something caught my eye. A circle of flattened grass around a metal object, partly buried under leaves. I walked closer and realized it was a trap, one of those heavy-duty ones meant for large animals. It was already sprung, thankfully empty. I didn't touch it, but I crouched to look at the mechanism. It wasn't rusted. Someone had set it recently. That wasn't unusual for rural areas, but the placement felt off. It wasn't near a trail or a clearing. It was right behind a rental cabin. I headed back inside, trying not to think too much about it. The host had mentioned that hunters pass through sometimes. Maybe one of them had permission. Maybe someone forgot to pick up their equipment. It didn't feel worth messaging her about. The first night was quiet. Cold wind, creaking wood. Nothing strange. The morning was clear, so I decided to explore the area around the cabin before going on the longer hike. A few minutes into the trees, I found a second trap. This one wasn't sprung. Its jaws were open, teeth glinting under frost. It sat in a narrow animal path, carefully positioned. I stepped back and marked the spot on my map so I wouldn't forget. As I walked farther, I found more. 4 in total, all arranged in what looked like a pattern, each one positioned along a rough arc around the cabin. That made me uneasy. Hunters usually placed traps where the animals moved, not in a shape around a structure where people stayed. There were old boot prints around them, deep impressions from someone heavy. Some prints overlapped, indicating repeated visits. Whoever set them came back often. I returned to the cabin and finally messaged the host. She replied hours later, saying no one had permission to trap on her land. She sounded concerned, but told me she'd make some calls. That didn't help me much because I planned to be there for 2 nights. The traps were already set, and the person who placed them could easily return before she sorted things out. In the afternoon, I heard something metallic behind the cabin. It was a short, sharp impact, like metal hitting stone. When I stepped onto the porch, no one was there. I walked around the side of the cabin and saw fresh soil disturbed near one of the traps I'd passed earlier. Someone had reset it. The leaves weren't frozen like the ones I stepped on earlier. That meant whoever had done it was nearby. I went back inside and locked the door. For the next hour, I listened to the woods. Nothing obvious happened, but the silence felt heavier than before. Each time the wind shifted, the cabin creaked in a way that made it sound like someone stepped on the porch. At sunset, I noticed a small marker tied to a branch near the tree line, a piece of red tape that hadn't been there earlier. It was angled toward the cabin. I didn't want to go near it, but it was impossible not to see. Whoever set the traps was marking distances or routes. This wasn't casual hunting. It felt methodical. As it got darker, I tried to distract myself by making dinner, but I kept glancing through the blinds at the woods. Around 8, a distant metallic snap echoed through the trees. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. One of the traps had just closed. I didn't hear any animal noise afterward, which felt strange. I waited for movement, rustling, anything. The woods stayed silent. A little later, I saw a flashlight beam sweep across the trees. It came from deeper in the woods, slowly moving side to side, following a straight path. The beam stayed low to the ground, like the person was scanning for something. I turned off the cabin lights to avoid drawing attention. A few minutes later, the beam passed behind the cabin and stopped near one of the traps. I heard faint metal clinking, then movement in the leaves. Whoever it was cleared the trap quickly and quietly. When the light moved again, it angled upward for a moment, as if the person was looking directly at the cabin. I stepped away from the window and stayed still. The beam didn't linger long. It drifted off toward the deeper trees and disappeared. I sat on the couch, trying to steady myself. I considered calling the sheriff, but nothing directly threatening had happened. I didn't know if anyone would take it seriously, especially if the traps were technically legal on public land. Still, the host had said they shouldn't be there. I messaged her again, telling her someone was actively resetting them. She didn't respond. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow ones, circling the cabin, not trying the doors, just moving through the leaves with deliberate pace. I stayed completely still. The footsteps paused near the kitchen window, then continued around the back. When I finally gathered the nerve to look through the blinds, the porch was empty, but a fresh track of compressed leaves led from the steps into the woods. I didn't sleep. Every couple of hours I checked outside. Nothing changed until just before sunrise, when I noticed something on the porch. An empty trap, smaller than the others, placed neatly in front of the door. It wasn't sprung, it wasn't damaged, it was just set down like a message. I didn't touch it. I didn't even open the door to move it aside. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things quickly. As I carried my bag to the car, I noticed new markers on branches, green ones this time. They formed a line leading from the deeper woods right toward the cabin, like someone had marked a path. Farther out, I saw disturbed ground where another trap had been removed. Whoever set them wasn't trying to catch animals anymore. They were adjusting their position, closer to the cabin. Right before I got into my car, I heard a branch snap deep in the woods. Not an animal. It was too decisive, too controlled. I didn't wait to confirm. I drove down the dirt road faster than I should have, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. When I reached cell service, I finally got a reply from the host. She said the local warden had been notified, and a deputy was supposed to check the property that morning. I didn't bother returning. I told her what I'd seen and left it at that. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking about the traps. The fact that someone placed them in a pattern around a cabin they knew people rented. Someone who moved quietly, reset them at night, and left a smaller one on the porch, not as bait, but as a warning. I never found out what they wanted. Maybe they were sending a message to anyone who stayed there. Maybe I arrived at a bad time. Maybe they expected to come back and didn't like finding someone else in the middle of their routine. Whatever the reason, I didn't rent cabins for a long time after that. It's hard to relax in the woods when you know how easy it is for someone to move around you without making a sound. I booked the cabin because I wanted a quiet place for a weekend. The photos showed a simple one-room structure, a small porch, and a lake a short walk away. What caught my eye even then was the shed behind it, a wooden, weathered box of a building with a heavy lock on the front. The listing said it was owner storage and had to remain shut. I didn't plan on going near it. When I arrived, the shed looked older than the cabin. The boards were warped, the roof sloped at an odd angle, and the lock looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Nothing about it felt threatening. It just looked forgotten. I brought my bags inside the cabin, turned on the heater, and walked through the place. It smelled like wood and cleaning spray. Everything seemed normal. That first afternoon, I took a walk down to the lake. The wind was sharp, and thin ice formed along the edges of the water. When I came back, the cabin felt colder than expected. I walked to the kitchen window and glanced at the shed without thinking. Something small caught my attention. The soil at the base of the shed had a line of disturbed dirt, like a fresh footprint dragged through frost. I assumed an animal had nosed around. I didn't look closely. That night, I heard a single sound outside. Not footsteps, just the shift of weight on frozen leaves. A quick, short noise. Then silence. I listened for more, but nothing followed. I told myself it was wildlife and went back to sleep. In the morning, I stepped outside and noticed fresh marks on the shed lock. Thin scratches, recent enough to stand out against the rust. I checked the cabin door too. No damage. I walked around the shed at a distance. The soil along the side walls was pressed down in a pattern that didn't look like random animal movement. Someone had stood there, more than once. I messaged the host, asking if anyone else had access. She replied that no one should be on the property and said she'd check with the caretaker. Her response didn't make me feel any better. If someone had been there, they moved quietly and left almost no trace. I tried to distract myself by going on another walk. When I came back in the late afternoon, the sun was already low. The shed looked the same, but there was a change I couldn't immediately place. I made dinner, checked a few messages, and kept glancing toward the kitchen window without meaning to. Around 9, I heard a dull thud against the back wall of the cabin. Then another, softer one. It didn't sound like knocking, more like someone set something heavy down and shifted it. I moved quietly to the window. The shed seemed unchanged, but the lock now hung slightly differently, like it had been handled recently. I closed the curtains. I didn't want to keep checking. I forced myself to go to bed, though the cabin creaked in a way that made sleep difficult. Nothing else happened that night. When I woke up, sunlight hit the floor through the blinds. I stepped outside for air, looked toward the shed, and saw the door slightly open. Just a few inches, but open. The lock was on the ground beside it, intact but unlatched. I didn't want to look inside, but leaving it open felt worse. I approached slowly. The interior smelled damp and stale. Sunlight lit the first few feet, revealing crates stacked against the back wall. Some were open. Inside were tools, rope, and metal parts, more than what made sense for a simple rental property. The tools weren't new. They didn't look like they'd been used for cabin maintenance. They looked like equipment someone stored for their own work. What unsettled me most was the ground. A long, narrow mark in the dirt led from the far wall toward the door, like something heavy had been dragged out. Whatever it wasn't there anymore. I backed away and returned to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I messaged the host again. She apologized repeatedly and said maybe the caretaker had stopped by early. That explanation didn't match the tracks on the ground. Whoever entered the shed moved with intention, not like someone doing a routine check. In the afternoon, a truck approached the property. I expected the caretaker. Instead, a man I didn't recognize stepped out. Tall, broad, jacket zipped to his throat, gloves on. He looked at the cabin for a moment, then walked straight toward the shed without acknowledging me. He opened the shed door wider and examined the interior. He bent down to pick up the fallen lock, turned it in his hand, then set it on a crate. I opened the cabin door slightly and said, "The lock was off this morning." He didn't respond immediately. He nodded once, set the lock aside, and walked around the shed, inspecting the ground. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look confused. He seemed like someone checking a situation he already understood. He inspected the soil, the tracks, and the area near the tree line. Then he returned to his truck but didn't leave. He sat inside with the engine off, watching the woods. Before sunset, he drove off without speaking again. The silence afterward felt heavy. I stayed inside, watching the shed through a small gap in the curtains. The yard was empty, but I felt like someone was still nearby. The way the man acted told me he expected whoever opened the shed to return. Around 10, I heard rustling near the shed. Slow movements, pausing between steps. Then the faint scrape of metal. Someone touching the discarded lock or something near it. I stayed still and quiet. The footsteps moved toward the cabin, stopping near the kitchen window. Then they shifted back toward the shed, then around the side of the cabin. Whoever it was didn't knock or try the door. They just moved with patience, like they were familiar with the property. Eventually, the sounds faded into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When daylight returned, the shed door was closed again, but the lock was gone. The crates inside had been rearranged. The drag marks on the ground were disturbed in a new direction, suggesting something else had been moved during the night. The host messaged me that morning, saying the caretaker was on the way now. I didn't wait. I packed quickly, left the key on the table, and walked to the car. As I pulled away, I noticed new, heavy tracks leading from deeper in the woods toward the shed, as if someone had returned early that morning. Whatever had been stored in that shed had nothing to do with me, and whoever kept returning for it clearly didn't feel the need to announce themselves. I left the cabin behind, but the image of the unlocked shed door stayed with me, because it wasn't about what was inside. It was about how quietly someone came for it, and how close I had been while it happened.